The lights on the set were blazing the way they always are, warm and unforgiving, designed to flatter smiles and soften tension, but that morning the air felt heavier, like something unscripted was waiting to break through. The View had built its reputation on heated conversations, fast interruptions, and emotional certainty. The audience expected sparks. What they didn't expect was silence. Thomas Sowell wasn't there to perform, posture, or plead for approval. He arrived with the calm of a man who has already had every argument screamed at him for decades and survived by answering with facts instead of fury. The conversation began predictably. A familiar topic about inequality, power, and blame. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward, her voice rising, her hands moving as if conviction itself could substitute for evidence. The audience reacted on cue, clapping at the right moments, nodding at the familiar lines. This was home field advantage. But Sowell didn't interrupt. He didn't smirk. He didn't roll his eyes. He waited, the way a professor waits for a student to finish an emotional answer before gently asking the question that exposes everything missing underneath it. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. That was the first shock. He thanked her for the question and then calmly reframed it. Not with ideology, but with history. He spoke about patterns, not people. Incentives, not intentions. Consequences, not slogans. The room shifted. Whoopi jumped back in quickly, cutting him off, insisting that lived experience mattered more than statistics. The crowd applauded again, but this time it felt thinner, like a reflex instead of belief. Sowell nodded and said something that landed like a stone dropped into water. He agreed that lived experience matters, then asked whose experience we choose to ignore when policies fail the very people they claim to help. He cited examples from decades of research, from communities harmed by well-meaning programs, from data collected long before social media turned outrage into currency. He didn't accuse. He explained. And explanation is dangerous in a room built for reaction. Whoopi's tone sharpened. She challenged his credibility, his relevance, the era he came from. The tactic was familiar. Discredit the messenger when the message becomes uncomfortable. But Sowell didn't defend himself. He did something far more unsettling. He quoted outcomes. Employment rates before and after certain policies. Education results across generations. Family stability statistics that refused to bend to emotional framing. Each sentence was delivered evenly, almost gently, like he was offering the audience a chance to step back from the noise and look at the scoreboard. The audience grew quieter. Even the co-hosts who usually jumped in stayed still, sensing that this wasn't the usual back and forth. Whoopi raised her voice again, insisting that compassion should lead policy, not cold numbers. Sowell responded with a line that cut through the studio without raising its volume. He said compassion without results is not compassion at all, it is performance. And performance feels good until the curtain falls and the damage remains. You could see it on Whoopi's face, the frustration of someone used to winning arguments through force of personality. She tried to regain control, speaking faster, interrupting more often, appealing directly to the audience's emotions. But something had shifted. The applause didn't come as easily now. People were listening instead of reacting. And in a show built on momentum, listening is a kind of rebellion. Sowell continued, explaining that intentions don't pay rent, don't educate children, don't keep neighborhoods safe. Outcomes do. He reminded everyone that the people who suffer most from failed ideas are rarely the ones applauding for them on television. They are off camera, living with consequences long after the segment ends. His words weren't cruel. That was the most devastating part. They were calm, measured, and grounded in reality. By the end of the segment, Whoopi tried one last time to reclaim the emotional high ground, accusing him of lacking empathy. Sowell looked at her, not with anger, but with something closer to disappointment. He said empathy that ignores evidence becomes arrogance, because it assumes we know better than reality itself. The studio fell into an uneasy quiet. The lights were still bright, but the comfort was gone. Part 2. When the cameras cut to commercial, the tension didn't disappear. It lingered, hanging over the set like smoke after a fire. Viewers at home felt it too, flooding social media not with the usual clipped applause lines, but with long quotes, timestamps, and replays. Something rare had happened. A man had walked into one of the loudest rooms in daytime television and refused to raise his voice. And by doing so, he had taken control of the conversation. When the show returned, the energy was different. The host smiled, but it felt forced, like a reset that didn't quite take. Whoopi tried to steer the discussion back to safer ground, but the audience could sense the unresolved clash beneath the surface. Sowell was given another moment to speak, and this time he addressed the viewers directly, not as voters or activists but as thinkers. He urged them to question narratives that feel good but fail in practice. He reminded them that disagreement is not cruelty, and that facts are not an attack. He spoke about the danger of treating complex social problems as morality plays with heroes and villains. He explained that reality is messier, and that pretending otherwise leads to policies that satisfy egos while harming lives. Each sentence felt like a quiet challenge, not just to the hosts, but to the culture of outrage itself. Whoopi listened, arms crossed, her expression tight. She wasn't losing an argument in the traditional sense. She was losing control of the frame. The most striking moment came when Sowell addressed the idea of silencing opposing views for the sake of feelings. He said a society that cannot tolerate uncomfortable facts is one that chooses stagnation over progress. He didn't name names. He didn't accuse the show. He simply stated the principle. And in doing so, he forced the audience to draw their own conclusions. Whoopi attempted a final rebuttal, but it lacked the fire from earlier. The confidence was gone. The rhythm was off. She spoke about unity and kindness, but the words felt disconnected from the evidence just presented. Sowell thanked her again, genuinely, and said that true unity comes from honesty, not enforced agreement. The segment ended without a dramatic walk-off, no shouting match, no viral scream. And that's why it hit harder. After the show, clips spread rapidly online. Not because of a meltdown, but because of restraint. Commentators on all sides weighed in, some praising Sowell's composure, others criticizing the platform for allowing such a challenge to their usual narrative. But even critics had to engage with the substance. The conversation had shifted beyond soundbites. What made the moment resonate wasn't that Thomas Sowell destroyed anyone in the theatrical sense. It was that he exposed the weakness of volume without substance. He showed that losing control doesn't always look like yelling. Sometimes it looks like being unable to answer a calm question with an honest result. Whoopi Goldberg, a seasoned performer and cultural figure, found herself facing something her instincts couldn't overpower. Data, history, consequences. In the days that followed, the phrase, compassion without results as performance, echoed across platforms. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Parents debated it at dinner tables. People who had never read Sowell before picked up his books, curious about the man who refused to play the role assigned to him. The View moved on, as it always does, to the next topic, the next controversy. But something had cracked. The real impact of the moment wasn't about politics. It was about discourse. It reminded people that shouting down opposing ideas doesn't make them disappear. It only delays the reckoning. Sowell didn't win by dominating the room. He won by inviting the audience to think, and trusting them enough to handle the truth without being yelled into submission. In a media world addicted to outrage, that quiet confidence felt almost revolutionary. And long after the applause faded and the studio lights dimmed, one thing remained clear. Control isn't about who speaks the loudest. It belongs to the one who understands the facts, respects the audience, and refuses to confuse emotion with truth. The applause had stopped, but the tension hadn't left the room. What followed wasn't noise, it was something far more unsettling for live television. The moment the conversation resumed, everyone could feel that the balance had shifted. The energy that usually powered the set felt restrained, like a car revving in neutral. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, trying to project authority, but authority on television depends on momentum, and momentum had slipped away. Thomas Sowell sat calmly, hands folded, not triumphant, not defensive, just present. That alone unsettled the rhythm of the show. Whoopi attempted to steer the discussion toward broader themes, talking about unity, lived realities, and moral responsibility. Her voice was steadier now, less explosive, but also less commanding. Sowell listened without interruption, the same way he had before, allowing every word to land. When he responded, he didn't contradict her values. He questioned the results attached to them. That distinction mattered, and it landed hard. He spoke about how good intentions have been used throughout history to justify policies that ultimately hurt the very communities they were meant to protect. He didn't frame it as blame. He framed it as a warning. History, he said, is full of examples where emotion led the charge and evidence was asked to clean up afterward. The studio audience grew noticeably quieter. This wasn't a moment built for clapping. It was built for thinking. Whoopi interjected again, her frustration surfacing, arguing that numbers can be manipulated and that pain cannot be quantified. Sowell nodded and agreed that data can be abused, then calmly added that ignoring data entirely guarantees abuse will go unnoticed. That single sentence seemed to drain the air from the room. It wasn't confrontational. It was precise. And precision is difficult to fight without preparation. One of the co-hosts tried to soften the exchange, making a comment about differing perspectives being healthy. Sowell welcomed that point and expanded on it, saying real diversity of thought only exists when disagreement is allowed to finish a sentence. The implication didn't need to be spoken aloud. Everyone knew where it landed. Whoopi shifted in her seat, clearly aware that the audience was following his reasoning step by step. As the discussion moved forward, Sowell addressed the viewers directly, reminding them that television arguments are temporary, but policy outcomes are permanent. He urged people to ask not whether an idea sounds caring, but whether it actually works. His tone never changed. That consistency became his strongest weapon. There was no emotional spike to attack, no outburst to clip out of context. Whoopi tried one final time to reassert control by framing the debate as academic theory versus real-world struggle. Sowell responded by sharing examples drawn directly from communities affected by failed programs, emphasizing that his conclusions were not formed in isolation but through decades of observation and study. He spoke about listening to people after the cameras leave, after the slogans fade, when results are all that remain. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Live television thrives on noise, and this was something else entirely. Whoopi smiled tightly and thanked him for his perspective, but the words felt procedural. The segment wrapped without fireworks, without shouting, without closure. And that was the problem. There was nothing easy to dismiss. When the show ended, the real impact began. Clips circulated rapidly, not because of a viral meltdown, but because viewers weren't used to seeing calm dismantle chaos. Comment sections filled with long discussions instead of one-line reactions. People argued, but they argued about substance. That alone marked a shift. Supporters of the show defended Whoopi, saying emotion matters, that empathy should never be sidelined. Others pointed out that Sowell never rejected empathy, he challenged empty empathy. That distinction became the core of the debate. Not left versus right, but intention versus outcome. The conversation escaped the boundaries of the show and took on a life of its own. What stood out most to many viewers was that Sowell never tried to win, in the traditional sense. He didn't dominate airtime. He didn't belittle anyone. He didn't raise his voice when interrupted. He trusted that clarity would do the work for him. In a media environment built on escalation, that restraint felt almost radical. Whoopi Goldberg, a veteran of countless heated exchanges, found herself in unfamiliar territory. Not because she was shouted down, but because she was outpaced by patience. Losing control didn't look like anger exploding. It looked like being unable to steer a conversation back to safe emotional ground once facts had taken the wheel. In the days that followed, commentators tried to frame the moment as a clash of generations, or styles, or ideologies. But viewers who watched closely saw something simpler. One side relied on volume and moral certainty. The other relied on evidence and calm repetition. When those two collide, volume eventually runs out. The legacy of the moment wasn't humiliation or triumph. It was discomfort, the kind that forces people to reconsider how debates are conducted and who truly holds power in them. Power, it turned out, didn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to the one who refused to let emotion replace reality. Long after the episode aired, the image that lingered wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic exit. It was a quiet man sitting still while the room around him struggled to regain control. And for many watching, that silence said more than any outburst ever could.